the West Coast, we start at 8:30 in the morning, because it's 5:30 my time. So I'm going to move slow and also fast. First of all, I just want to say I'm so grateful to be here. This is an incredible space to speak in. I usually speak in lecture halls and, kind of interior spaces that are not quite as character-rich, and I think this was really incredible. And it's an amazing event that you guys do here in the state, that you come all together to really talk about different ideas between building, real estate, development, preservation. So it's just really an honor to be here, so thank you for having me. So, yes, I'm a professor, I'm an academic, but I'm actually not really. I mean, I've been teaching for 20 years, but by training I'm an architect and also an architectural historian. I went to the undergraduate, for my undergraduate in architecture at the school I teach in Seattle, but I went to graduate school in Virginia, so I really have kind of this coast-to-coast kind of idea of what buildings look like and how old they are. And I say that. Can't hear me? There you go. There we go. We need to invent something that works better for women. Work on it. We all should work on it. So, I'm not going to repeat that, but I have lived on all coasts and I've spent a lot of time in Europe, and my biggest love in my life, besides my two children and my husband, are old buildings. I love old buildings. And so I teach in a design department that really focuses on modernism and design for new buildings and greening, making these great new LEED certified or Living Building Challenge net zero buildings. And I've always kind of had this problem with that, in the way that we have torn down a lot of buildings that have perfectly good use in them, and then we rebuild them green. And intuitively, that never really worked for me. So why would we do that with an existing building, throw into a landfill, and then rebuild something green, when we could have just taken that building that already has so much history and memory and character, we've already extracted the materials, and make that a greener building. So that's what I've been working on the last couple of years, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I guess the biggest question is, for me, to start out with, is what is a sustainable building? And, green and sustainability, these words, these buzzwords, resiliency is kind of a newer one that we hear a lot, is something that we all know how to do intuitively. We kind of know we want to have higher efficiency, we want to spend less money and energy, take less resources from the earth. But how do we do that? So what I'm going to talk about today is essentially 3 points. So I'm going to start talking about historic preservation. Now, coming from Seattle, we are like the oldest corner of the United States. Excuse me, we are the youngest corner of the United States. You guys are old, I'm not. Relatively. So we have very few older buildings because we were incorporated in 1889 as a state, but our oldest building is probably, I think our oldest one in our state is about 1860, maybe. Most of our building stocks, that's old. It's around 1889 from our coast fire in Seattle, and then around the rural areas around the same era. So we don't really have a ton of old buildings, but to us they mean a lot. But we also have had a crazy, I don't know if you've heard about these companies called Amazon and Microsoft. We have a crazy building boom in our city and in our state right now, so we've been looking at historic preservation, I think, in the wrong way. So I want to talk about historic preservation, but also not in the way that is the typical historic preservation, really in the way that buildings are artifacts and they have value whether they're nominated as a landmark or not. Then I want to talk about the idea behind that. How can we actually quantify, besides looking at the emotional, adorable character that we like in old buildings, let's talk about them as artifacts of energy and materials. Scientific, just talk about the sustainable aspect of an existing building. And then I'm going to talk about how we can green these buildings and make them more sustainable. So I'm going to start with, and I have a lot of slides because I love pictures and I just have a lot. So I'm going to go through some of them kind of slowly, and I'm hoping these are going to be posted somewhere so you can look at them as long as you want. So just historic preservation. How many people here are historic preservationists? Yes, I like that. Okay, so for those of you who are not, you're going to get the 4-slide history of historic preservation in the United States. We started with Yellowstone Park in 1872. The first nationally designated park in the world. We have so many great things we've done in this country. Really important. And then we started to kind of look at buildings that were important, especially when buildings like this, Mount Vernon, George Washington's first home, was about to be sold by his nephew because he couldn't afford it. So a garden society of ladies came together, purchased it, and made it into one of the first house museum to really represent what was important in our nation. So our history of historic preservation in the country is really about saving the things that made our nation's story. That's how we started. We want to make battlefields important. We want to have, where Abraham Lincoln slept, the major buildings that formed our nation. So that's really where we started as historic preservationists. It wasn't until 1964 when this building, Penn Station by McKinley and White, very well-known architects, was demolished for Madison Square Garden, that people started to kind of come up in arms and say, what are we doing? We're tearing down buildings that mean something to us. And this is really something that happened over and over again. That last minute wrecking ball, oh no, let's rally behind it, try to save it, and quite often it doesn't work. So preservation has always been a little haphazard. It's not intentional, meaning you can't just assume that a building is beautiful, character-rich, important to the community, that it has any protection that will ever have any guarantee to stay. We're really a country of our own property rights, and so in that way, it's very difficult to do that. So when Penn Station, beautiful building here, was demolished, what happened is that they got together in October of 1966, which just turned 50 a couple years ago, and created the National Historic Preservation Act. And basically, I'll just read the first fundamental idea. The idea was the spirit and direction of the nation are founded upon its historic heritage. So what that created is essentially two things. Well, it created a couple of things, but I'm going to focus on two things. National Historic Landmarks Program, which is the upper echelon, like the platinum level of protection. You can't touch it, you can't change it. It is a landmark. You guys here in the state have 44. We have a mere 30. We have a lot in common, Washington and Maine. A lot of ours have boats and maritime history. But that is a pretty small number, if you think about it, that has protection that can't be changed. The other thing that happened is that they established the National Register of Historic Places. Now this is the one that probably most people are familiar with, and often the one that I find in my work people are very confused about. So the National Register is a national listing, and all of these are registered by the National Park Service. And essentially, this is an honorific designation that says you are important, but it doesn't give you any protection. You can tear down something that's on the National Register. It does not matter. So there's no protection, there's no teeth. But as you can see here, Maine has 1,600. In Washington, we only have 700, relating the age thing here. And so with both of these things, what essentially established the idea is that they were trying to get an idea of how to create something that might be important to people. And the number one thing that came into play was age. So unless you're 50, stand up if you are 50 and over. Congratulations, you guys are important. All right, you can sit down now. Stand up if you're not over 50. You apparently are not worth much of anything. Just kidding, just kidding. You get my point. Okay, we had to have some point where we said there's a generation away that we said it's not an emotional connection. How do we find value? Age was the first thing. And then the other thing that we look at is the integrity, not the condition that could be falling down, but how much in its original state is it in? What is its significance? So there's a bunch of things like, is it related to a significant movement, a significant architectural style, maybe a significant person or event? And so these things really take a lot of work, quite honestly, to write a nomination. How many people here have written a nomination for a landmark? Okay, how many people think it's really easy and it takes one day? Yeah, it's like writing a thesis. And it's not that that it just becomes historic because it's important. Someone has to actually have the need or desire or want and make this a nomination. So again, it takes a lot of work to be historic, a historic landmark. That's the biggest thing, to be on the register. Another ton of work, but it doesn't protect anything. Now, why am I talking about this? All these things are great. Historic preservation is amazing. I always kind of joke that I'm not a preservationist because I was trained as an architect. but I think we all are actually historic preservationists, because if there's anyone, I'm not going to ask anyone to stand up or raise their hand for this question, but I can't imagine there's anyone here that doesn't like old buildings. I mean, why do we go travel, right? We don't travel, well, we travel for food. We don't travel to use language and be confused and not be able to communicate with people. We travel because we want to see the environment, the built environment, the natural environment, but cities and towns and the differences between our cultures and theirs. So we all love old buildings, and this was our first kind of attempt to really think about how we can save them. But it doesn't work all the time. And it's important, but it just doesn't always work. And I just pulled a couple examples here. Again, this is my second time to Maine. The first time I dipped in for lunch from New Hampshire. My sister's living there. So I can't say that I'm familiar with everything that's happened in this state, but I did find some really interesting projects that I think are good examples of how we've lost really important buildings. So this is Union Station. That was, very typical. The original use, like we're looking at here, was a railroad station. It fell out of use. Developers started to buy it, and it was changed into, I believe, a mall. This is another one that's really interesting. This is, a lot of reasons happen as to how we lose important buildings. So this one is the Marcel Dowell House, which is stood in the middle of a small town in Maine that really was just essentially demolition by neglect. Nobody took care of it, and it got to the point where you couldn't fix it. So this is a really, for me, these kind of rural towns in our country are so critical. They have so much character, and there's so many different buildings that really identify with that community. And if we don't have this, idea or use to keep it up, at least so it can stand longer, it will be demolished by neglect. In other words, demolished beyond repair. This is another one I think is interesting. It's a whole series of residential streets, Spring Street in Portland, that was changed because of our development of new road patterns and arterials that you can go through. So there's a lot of reasons why, in the front one she's like, oh my God. So sad. Yeah, it's emotional. These things are emotional, and it can be challenging. So I guess this idea of we're not going to save every building, and why should we? We don't need to save every building on the planet. But it is important to realize the different venues that we have to do that through historic preservation. And then I'm going to make an argument for why there's another reason to do as well. So some of the things that are available to us across the country and in Maine are things that are incentives for us to help pay for upkeep of buildings. One of the things I think is the biggest mistake is that people assume that if you're going to rehabilitate a building to reuse it, you have to do the whole thing. One of the most important things that architects aren't taught in school is to design buildings and to maintain buildings. Design buildings so they can be fixed easily, not confusingly. Your dad is an architect, someone can come to your building and you can easily maintain and fix it. And also just the idea of small repairs mean a lot. Small repairs mean a lot. It's like sunscreen every time you go outside. It's not a big thing you're going to notice the next day, but over time, your skin hopefully won't fall off or get cancer. So, small moments. So, but for bigger things, there are great things that have happened in Maine here and things that have happened nationally, using things like tax credits. This is a huge amount of money savings that you can get in terms of a rehabilitation credit. Another really inventive thing that I've seen going on around the nation is something like this. So range halls are such a great resource in every state. I've seen them in Maine. There's about 350. We have almost the same amount in Washington. In fact, I had a thesis student last quarter who drove around to 270 range halls in Washington state and documented every single one. The majority of them were not being used because they were in rural areas. Some have been turned into houses, some were community centers still. But this one did not have the money for funding, and from an article that I read, they used something very inventive. They used crowdfunding, and they just got enough money to kind of keep it going so it would not be demolished by neglect. So preservation incentives are huge. They have a lot of money. They take time to find them sometimes, but you can get up to, especially in Maine, which is way better than Washington State, up to 45% tax credits on your rehabilitation building project if your building is listed on the National Register or any other local register. So my first point would be preservation doesn't work all the time in this technical way, but it can. So if you have a building or a project that you can't fund, nominate it for National Register and rehabilitate it and get this money. This is free money that they want the state and the federal government wants you to use. In Maine also, there's a lot of different things for smaller projects. There's something that we don't have, small project renovations, and also affordable housing rehabilitation credit for affordable housing projects, pieces that have even a little bit of that. So there's really great tax incentives to do this. There's also a lot of grants out there that can help you with the rehabilitation. So, you know, historic preservation has its place, and I would really promote the idea that if you have a building that you don't want to radically alter and you're willing to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, which is essentially keeping the building relatively historic, find someone to nominate it. You can do it yourself, but again, it's like writing a thesis. There's a lot of research. It's a historical report, essentially, and use that tool. Because it's not used enough, and it's typically used only by those who really are aware of it, because they're historic preservationists, or there's someone who's done a lot of these type of projects, or it's about to be torn down. So I would really say this is one of the greatest tools you can do for some of the older buildings that you really want to use. But again, you have to be 50 years old, that critical age. It's a good age, 50. So preservation is great, but it can only do so much. This is an image of a building in my dear city of Seattle. This is what's going on a lot. And one of the things with preservation incentives is that they can be written so they can also be taken advantage of. So this is what we call facadism. This actually qualified for a tax rebate in the city for preservation. Does that look like a preserved building? Yeah, no. These are all over. It was a code that was written, and it was one of those codes that can kind of had a lot of loopholes, and so a lot of developers were taking advantage of it. I have to say, you know, there are certain buildings like this that are better than completely tearing down and building new ones for me, still adds a little bit of texture, but preservation rules and incentives can only go so far. So I guess I'd like to go to the next step here and talk about why existing buildings, and I'm not going to talk just historic buildings, just any existing buildings, why they matter and why they have value. So we're sitting in a warehouse. I assume this is not a train shed, but it could have been a train shed. I'm guessing this is not a landmark. Can anyone verify that? Is this a landmark building, or is that building a landmark building? No. No, it should be. No. No, it shouldn't be? Are you arguing with me?
Oh boy.
Railroad corridor, right? Okay, so the corridor is preserved. Excellent. Okay. Well, let's say we're in the middle of nowhere and this is just a big barn and it's not preserved. It still is really cool, and it has character and it has shelter, and you can imagine how many different things went into building this building. So I want to talk a little bit about the problem of how we look at buildings and why that affects the environment. So there's no news here. We're in a climate crisis. There's a lot of things that we're trying to do. It's so difficult. We're trying to recycle ourselves, save our water. As individual domestic dwellers in this country, there's a lot of little things you can do, but sometimes it kind of feels like a spit in the bucket. And we're looking for these grand gestures. So one of the things that you find in the building industry is you are inundated with what's often called greenwashing, just some kind of terminology that makes it sound green. It might be green, it might be sustainable, but not necessarily the facts. One really good example of that for me is I did a study on plastic bags. So in Seattle, I don't know if you guys have done this, in Seattle, we now charge if you're going to use a grocery bag. Most people use the reusable bags now. And plastic bags, those thin ones, are actually illegal. So that sounds really dangerous. They're not allowed to be sold in grocery stores. So I did a study that actually illustrated with the number of bags that are used for grocery stores and the amount of reusable bags that are now produced. Like you can go to Whole Foods or a Safeway and you can buy these really thick, durable bags. Those take about 60% more material and energy to produce than the small plastic bags. So if we just kind of use the small plastic bags over again, than producing these bigger, thicker ones, we actually would be saving a lot of energy and a lot of material resources. The same goes for water bottles. I have 2 teenagers, 16 and 18. If I could tell you how many reusable water bottles I have purchased for them, because they lose them all the time. Has anyone here ever owned one reusable water bottle and kept it their entire life? You? Give this man a round of applause, seriously. I mean, that's impressive. So this kind of idea of it seems green, but maybe it's not so green is an important thing to think about. So there's a lot of things kind of focused on resource overconsumption. That's one of our biggest problems. In the United States, and I always feel bad about this because, we kind of get this guilt trip being this, such a strong nation, and we do use a lot of resources, but we use 4 planets of resources in the United States alone. We are born on the basis of the economy of consumption. And this was specifically produced in the post-World War II era when we were, coming out of the war and we needed to, strengthen our economy. And we talk to each other on the news even. We're not people or communities, we're consumers. We talk about us as consumers. We don't even have a name, like, people who live, Maine, what do you call them, Mainites? Mainers. That's a cool name, Mainers. Makes you sound like you're like the most important people. Mainers, right. You're not though. Huh?
Or maniacs.
Or maniacs. I like that too. Kind of depends on the day. But that's better than consumers, right? We do more than just consume, but we actually do consume a lot. So let's look back to this idea of this mantra. We see this all the time. It's in all the Seattle recycle trucks. I've seen it here. It's on garbage cans, recycle cans. You guys are very, very forward-thinking. I see compost. I see, recycling cans. There's some states you go to that have absolutely like recycling. What's that? And I was in Alabama recently for an opening of a museum down in Montgomery, and I was looking for a recycling bin for my Diet Coke. I couldn't find it anywhere, and I put it in the garbage can, and I was just like, I feel so guilty. Because that was the way I was raised, but that's not, that's just our culture of being, really strong. But you know what? That actually still, it's a spit in the bucket. So reduce, reuse, recycle. This is not really the original one. The original one looked like this. So we lost 2 of the 5 things that are really important. The first one that we should all be thinking about is prevention. Prevention of material resource consumption. Just use what you have. Use what you've got. Fix it. Number 2, minimize. So it's like that subtlety between reuse, it's like minimizing it, what you can do with it, small changes. Then you get into reuse, like reuse it for something else, or you can recycle it into another use, but you're not changing the chemical composition. Then you get into recycling, and then you get into something called energy recovery, which we don't talk about a lot either. I'm not going to get into it. The final act being disposal. So we need to be a little bit more granulated in the way that we think about both our artifacts, our water bottles, thanks to that man in the red shirt, and paper bags and buildings. They're not different. We need to shift our thinking the same way we think about our domestic art. So that gets to my humble toaster analogy. I love the toaster, because I love toast. Okay, toasters are interesting. How many people here have had a toaster longer than 5 years? 10 years? 20 years? Anyone? 20 years? 25? Like an auctioneer. Okay, 20 years is good. 25? 30? Did you get it for your wedding? No? 40? How old is your toaster? 50 years! That's awesome! Another record. Okay, what's the point here? The point is that we don't build things to last anymore. I'm sure you've all heard the term planned obsolescence. This is a 1956 popular mechanics, I know it's really pixelated, but it's the only image I could get. 1956 Popular Mechanics article about how your toaster works. We can't fix our toasters anymore, they have a chip in them, right? So this idea of making things to fix and to last is a really important thing. Planned obsolescence is really part of our society. Okay, so I'm on a little bit longer, so I'm going to zip through the last section a little bit fast, but I'm going to finish with something kind of fun. So this is my point. Water bottles, plastic bags, toasters. Buildings are our largest manufactured artifacts. Why don't we look at them the same way? They have an inherent environmental value. This is something from 1979 from the National Trust for Historic Preservation during the OPEC oil crisis, when we all related to energy being gas. It takes energy to construct a new building, it saves energy to preserve an old one, and we can't build our way out of climate change. So, green building is not new green building. Green building is taking old buildings and making them green. This is what happens when we look at our building sector. Buildings are the largest consumers, both in the construction and the operation of energy. And ironically, as to what most people think, old buildings are not energy hogs. If you look at the pre-1920, 80,000 BTUs is an energy measure. If you look up into the 80s, which was a very bad period in terms of clothing, hairstyle, and energy consumption, it's really, buildings are actually performing worse. Now we're getting down into green buildings, we're getting a lot better, but what I would really say is that older buildings can be energy efficient. Another issue that we have is this demolition problem. 1/3 of our buildings within a 25-year period in the United States from 2004 to 2025 are going to be torn down and put into landfills. That's 1/3 of our buildings. That's a lot of energy. If you take that into consideration, it could power California, our largest state, for an entire decade if you take the energy embodied in that. And it really damages our ecological systems when we put these materials into landfills. I'm going to skip over this. We've torn down a lot of buildings in Seattle, lots of dots. So, buildings have this idea of embodied energy. They have energy that to take the ceiling of this, look at the aluminum in here and the steel. We had to go out, we had to extract it from the earth, we had to transport it to a factory, we had to manufacture it, we had to pay for people to come to that place, we had to use all those materials, a lot of waste goes into construction, manufacturing, and then we had to transport it, use more energy to erect it. That is the embodied energy. There's so much energy in each of these buildings that we should look at them not just as emotional, historic, and architectural artifacts, but also as repositories of energy. I've done this a lot with different buildings. I actually saved this cute little building from 1929. It was an old Navy fire station, and I turned it into kind of this idea of what it actually reflected in gasoline, in carbon sequester, in the amount of trash. This would mean if you put this into a landfill, which is where it was about to go, it would take my recycling or my trash every day. The average American puts 4.5 pounds of trash in the garbage for 1,444 years. And I'm not going to live that long. Really quickly, just for one more number. This is a large school that was demolished recently to build another school, ironically. Translating that into gasoline energy, and by the way, you guys have really cheap gas here. Because I translate that to gas, the cost of that demolition of what that was valued at in Maine is $6,839,000, in Washington $9,000,000 2026. So a lot of money, a lot of gas, a lot of CO2 emissions, and a lot of demolition waste. So these are the ecological problems that we have in terms of tearing buildings down and not using them in sight. So I'm gonna kind of skip past some of these, but the basic idea is that if we can green them rather than demolish them and build new green buildings, studies have shown that we can save 10 to 80 years, depending on the building typology, of environmental damage than it would be if we had torn that building down and built a new green building. So we can avoid negative effects by doing that. The last thing I'm going to do is just run through a couple examples. Kara, how off am I? Where is she? Oh, she left us off the floor. Okay. This is the EcoTrust building in Portland, Portland, Oregon. It was the first LEED certified renovation, and it was an old transfer station. And essentially it took three approaches. Historic preservation approaches to kind of retain its scale and its bulk. Architectural strategies that needed seismic reinforcing, that's a huge issue for us right now on the West Coast. We're always on the West Coast, so it did some strategies for that. And then sustainable strategies. This building is so green. It has a green roof, it saves all of its own water, it has more natural lighting, water efficient fixtures, very simple strategies that you can do that bring the cost down and the operating value down. And it also happens to be beautiful. Another building in St. Louis, same thing. It has solar tubes. It has a wind turbine. This one has a geothermal ground source heat pump. It has a solar array. One thing about solar that people don't seem to, how many people here have installed solar in one of their buildings? Good. Solar is underrated. You do not need sunlight for solar. You need daylight. You don't even need south-facing for solar. South-facing solar panels perform about 16% less than, north-facing solar panels perform about 16% less on average than south-facing ones. It just needs daylight. It is like the best free energy that you can get, and you guys have huge rebates for these in Maine. And then houses. Houses are kind of, I have 2 or 3 more minutes, and I'm feeling guilty up here. I was raised Catholic too. All your homes, energy homes. It's a misnomer that people think that energy leaves through windows. Where does energy go when it's warm? Up. Insulate the ceiling, insulate the base, and then go around with infiltration on your windows and don't replace them. The term replacement window should be illegal. Vinyl should be illegal. Thank you. Most of your heat escapes through the area around it. Caulk it up, you're in good shape. I'm doing this very briefly, but this is a building in Walla Walla, Washington, which is in the corner in the country. They did a lot of really great things just by blowing in insulation, using recycled jeans, taking everything and reusing every bit of the material, installing a ground source heat pump that took that even temperature of the ground, which is consistent everywhere, around 55, 56, depending on where you are. You can use it to heat, you can use it to cool, and it did an incredible amount of energy savings with little, simple moves. So I'm just going to move through some of these. You can renovate and you can green any building. These are all renovated buildings that are green, and I'm going really way out to show you some kind of fun projects. These are all very green buildings throughout the world. This is an old train track, essentially on the canal in Amsterdam that they made into an office building. This is a deconsecrated church in the Netherlands, which is a very popular bookstore. And this might be my favorite read. The point here is you can reuse anything. So this is in Poland. They didn't know what to do with it. It's huge. Think about the material here. So what do you think you would do with something like this? You turn it into a water park. Whoa. Look at this. Who wouldn't want to go there? Now, I'm not saying this is sustainable, but it's really cool. And it proves the fact that you can take any old building and reuse it if you have good design, creative ideas, and you do simple, straightforward greening of buildings. We know how to green buildings. It's not rocket science. We know how to reduce our energy costs and reduce how we consume energy and how we can save water. We power that together with reusing existing buildings, and we have the best solution. Isn't that cool? The best solution ever. So I'm going to end with these points that I'm not going to linger on, but I will have these up hopefully on the website. So these are just kind of bullet points because I know they really wanted to have takeaways. But I want to say Maine has a lot of really great incentives, great energy rebates, and amazing buildings. You guys could be the leaders in green building reuse, and I think you should be. And I think you're well on your way because you're all here. So thank you very much. Any questions? I guess I have questions, comments, arguments, or examples. We'd love to hear some examples. Yeah, back in the corner. Yeah. I think a microphone's coming. We can fix acoustics with old buildings too.
So I live right here in Lewiston in a project called the Raise Off. My building, the New England triple decker I live in, was built in 1912. Our cooperative bought the building, rehabbed it, and because it's a co-op, we're not for profit. So I have a 3-bedroom apartment that is up to code, perfectly livable, and my rent is $730 a month. And it's called a carrying charge, because all it does is take care of the cost of maintaining my home. I'm a part owner in the cooperative. I'm a low-income single mom. This is probably the closest I'll ever be to actually owning my own property. And it wouldn't be possible without going past the rent idea. It's an opportunity that I'm hoping to share with the rest of Maine and encourage in other places, because it's an opportunity for people with less resources to own things in a way that's not possible otherwise, or not easily possible otherwise.
Yeah, that brings up a really interesting point about community sharing of resources. One of the things that Dennis Hayes, who is the founder of the Bullet Foundation and one of the promoters of the first Earth Day, said is that we can't do things one unit at a time. We have to do scale jumping. And by scale jumping, he means crossing boundary line, property lines and working together and sharing. And I think in situations like that, and I don't know the situation specifically in Maine or the codes, so many codes need to be broken for us to do this. That's the bottom line. I mean, we just need, the codes are not set up for us to easily green buildings. But something like a shared water collection system, shared solar resources, and even across, the neighbors, if there's a community of 16 houses, there's district energy possibilities where you have a solar farm and you share it. Those reduce energy costs, and you can share the tax rebates. And I know the upfront costs can sometimes be be more challenging, but I think that brings up a great idea that we need to think more creatively beyond a single building. We need to work together and share across the ownership boundaries. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Allison Keller, and I'm a member of the Cameron Select Board. One question I have, or one difficulty that we've faced with trying to preserve historic buildings is that some of them are owned by municipalities, schools, nonprofit organizations, and the challenge of being able to take advantage of historic tax credits and trying to have a private entity take it over or lease it back. And do you have any strategies for how a nonprofit organization can take advantage of the tax credits for building reuse? Like say when you have a school and they want to tear it down and start over again.
Right.
What can that school do to take advantage of opportunities, if anything?
In my understanding in Maine, there's a small rehabilitation tax credit. It does not have to be a for-profit. It can be a non-profit. There are community grants that actually, in fact, like how to monetize it up front?
In order to benefit tax credit, you have to actually pay taxes.
Right, yeah, you have to monetize it up front. Yeah, that's an institutional issue that we're also working with in Washington State, where we're trying to get upfront grants for funding. So then you can have that, you can monetize that. I mean, it's great if you have a tax incentive, but if you have the money to do it, then how are you going to go forward, right? So I think one of the biggest things that all of us need to do is work with our lawmakers and talk about how we need to change some of the rules around preservation. It's not enough to say, do something and we'll give you a benefit later. It needs to come up front. And we're actually doing that right now in Seattle because we're about to have, the big earthquake is coming. We've had 3 in the last 60 years. But we have 1,200 just in the city of Seattle alone, unreinforced masonry buildings that are going to crumble on us. And they're about to make everybody retrofit them. Well, that's ridiculous because we have low-income housing, we've got schools, nobody can afford to do this. So right now we've been putting it off until we can figure out a series of different financial models that we can create this kind of solution. Because tax incentives will do nothing if you're a poor, low-income person and you have a small house or a small building. So I don't have the answer for that. It is challenging. I think we need to work with lawmakers. We need to make noise and talk about how we can do this and have incentives that are much more effective and that will actually affect change.
Yeah, hi. This runs a little counter to what your presentation was about, but in the event that houses or buildings need to be torn down for whatever reason, and maybe they're not 50 years old yet or whatever, or there's huge vacancy problems. I mean, can you talk, do you have any experience with, reusing, deconstruction, I guess? And can you just talk about that as a strategy?
Right, yeah. Deconstruction, whole building deconstruction is a great solution. I don't think that every single building on the planet needs to be saved. And I think I've seen a lot of houses dismantled one by one. The biggest thing is you have to, like anything, is you have to have someone who is willing to pay the price to deconstruct it. If you've ever seen anyone, you look at brick buildings that are about to be torn down, they're like, well, why don't they save the brick? Has anyone ever tried to dismantle brick by brick a building? I mean, I have so many friends of mine say, why don't they just take the bricks one by one? I'm like, well, you go do that. So it's expensive, but it is absolutely, it's easier with wood structures, there's no question. And so there's a lot of salvage yards. I'm assuming you guys all have building reuse type of shops where you can go and buy salvage materials. So there's a lot of companies out there. I think it's a building business. It certainly is in Washington State, Oregon, California, Montana. I've seen even in Alabama, huge businesses that go and say, you're gonna tear that building down, let me take care of that. It's like getting rid of, picking up your junk. But it's something that people will do because they don't have to pay the demolition cost, and someone else will remove for them. So I think there's a great business model in there, and I hope people take advantage of that. Yes.
Hi, my name is Kathryn Snyder, and I'm a concerned citizen on Mungo Hill in Portland, Maine. And I don't know if you've heard, but there's been quite a lot of demolitions on Mungo Hill, over 20 in the last 3 years. We've just had some huge demolitions at the base of Mungo Hill, 58 4th Street, and the Hamilton Marina. For these developers to build progress. So you did mention that the demolition by neglect, that's the excuses that they're using. What is that a justification for demoing? We understand it's the profit margin that drives progress, but is there a way that demolition by neglect cannot be used as an excuse to tear down buildings? Because as I said, we are having a lot of demolitions. We have been trying to stop them, but they continue on.
Are you talking residential, just out of curiosity?
Residential and commercial. 58 4th Street's a good example. It's a Portland company. It's one of the last streetcar manufacturing facilities. This beautiful brick, kind of like this, and it was just recently demoed for luxury condos and high-end. So we would like to get some more input and a lot of the expenses of demolition by neglect and disrepair and too much to repair. But I think your presentation was brilliant in regards to show how much energy consumption and the landfill waste. You provided real numbers, real counts to show how much it is economically not viable to demo any longer, especially in this world. So I would like to hear a little bit more about this reasoning for, how to get past this demolition by neglect and to repurpose.
I would say, thank you for that question. I think the two things that we need to do in this country, nationally, is we need to raise demolition fees and raise demolition permit fees. So anyone who's applied for a permit knows it takes a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of headache, at least it does in certain places. And to go get a demolition fee, it's actually not very expensive in most places. Now, I don't know the fees in Maine, but if you have demolition permits that require more kind of research, in the city of Seattle, if the building's over 25, you have to do a SECA report before you demolish a building. Quite honestly, it's kind of a joke. It's just a piece of paper, but it's at least looking at the environmental review of what the impact of tearing that building down is. It needs to go much further than that. We need to pause. We need to not move slowly. That building that in that small town that was in the corner, that house that was torn down now is just an empty lot. We see that all too often. Buildings are torn down because they look like they're in neglect and they're just demolished. Now, obviously there's safety issues and there's buildings that are sitting neglected, there's no owners, and so you want to make sure there's safe places so kids don't go in or people don't harm themselves. But I think the one thing that we could really do in terms of kind of codifying a new culture is that we need to make it more expensive to demolish a building. And we need to reflect the environmental damage of putting those buildings into landfills. When I talk about landfills, and we were talking about building reuse, one of the things that people tend to think is that you can put most of building materials into a recycling plant. Well, you can't recycle windows. You can recycle old windows, but new windows you cannot, because you cannot mix different types of heat strengthened glass, and you don't know what kind of heat strengthened glass it is when you take the window out and you put it into, into a recycling plant. And besides, newer windows are units; they're not glass and frames, and so you can't take them apart. You don't know what kind of glass it is, so those aren't recyclable. A lot of the concrete isn't recyclable because the admixture in the concrete can be environmental hazardous. We had a huge building on the campus, University of Washington, huge mid-century building that was a dorm that was torn down to build a dorm. And the concrete all had this really toxic material into it, so it all had to go into a landfill. So you don't know what's going to happen. You have to investigate these buildings, clearly. But we need to make it harder and more costly to do that so we can at least slow down and investigate. And I think also communities need to rally around buildings that are clearly under neglect. And so that even that small maintenance will prevent the demolition by neglect. There's no true demolition by neglect threshold. That's just a term people use that it's too expensive to repair. So, yeah. One more question. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Matt Hill. I'm the Director of Public Works for the City of Sanford. I'd like to compliment the question over here about private investing in these old buildings and mills and such, and note that the municipalities that I work for is actively trying to redevelop these things and basically trying to move many efforts forward simultaneously in order to make that attractive for that private investment to partner with the public side.
Right.
Many aspects of your presentation really touched on a lot of what's going on in Sanford right now. We've got a 50 megawatt solar array under construction. So, that kind of branding for us is really invaluable, and trying to reach out and make those kind of contacts is really important for us. But in addition to that question, what strategies can the municipality go after in order to try to make that happen?
Yeah, we bring up a really good point. Private and public partnerships are really the future for this kind of project. We have to get both involved. And if I understand, what was the last, can you repeat that last question? What can municipalities?
What strategies can the municipality go after in order to make those kinds of redevelopments happen?
I think the strategies that municipalities can do is it comes from both sides. One thing I think would be really important is for projects to illustrate that some of the codes go against the building reuse idea. There's a great example is a building that was done in our city that we broke 18 building codes to make sure that it would be a net zero building. We went above the height so we could get more window space to get more natural light. This was a new building, but these kind of things can also happen with existing buildings. Existing buildings actually face so many more challenges because, a lot of, especially for historic, we have to follow certain rules. Another thing that municipalities should look at is just changing the way we look at energy codes. There's a pilot project that happened in 3 cities on the West Coast called Performance-Based Energy Code, which essentially said, rather than the way that we typically write energy codes where it's prescriptive, you have to follow R19 in the wall and R30 in the ceiling, and this much fenestration and glazing, they said, you do whatever you want, but it has to perform at this level for a year. You have to make it perform. That's the way, that's creativity, that's the way we need to look at building codes. So I think that laws need to change and transform, and it will take us as a community and as builders and developers to change that culture. We have set up kind of this top-down way of looking at buildings as a one-size-fits-all, and they're not, especially for existing buildings. We need to be able to be flexible. We need to be able to say this wall is not going to be insulated because it's cool looking, and we'll insulate the roof of this so we can maintain the character. So there's a lot of things like that that I think really need to happen from the pressure of the public, as opposed to, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with building officials the way we've been doing it in the past, that's what we were kind of trained at, but we also know now it's not such a good idea to put a big main public road right in front of a waterway. We kind of want to enjoy our water, right? So urban renewal has taught us a lot of things. We've all made the same exact kind of assumptions over time, and now we're realizing that there are new ways to do things, and I think it's going to take pressure from the building industry to do that. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but I guess so.